Hello there, and welcome to FPL Heritage. We are getting incredibly close now. Gameweek 1 is almost here, preseason is coming to an end, and after another weekend of football, I think we've been given some really important clues about the players we should, and perhaps shouldn't, be considering for our opening FPL squads. We've had goals, assists, penalties, set pieces, potential out-of-position players, DEFCON monsters emerging, and yes, even a bicycle kick from an FPL defender. And some of what we've seen has definitely changed my thinking. So today, we're going through the biggest talking points from the final stages of preseason, looking specifically at the players who are actually on our FPL radar. And then, once we've gone through all the evidence, I'll show you my latest FPL Heritage Draft for Game Week 1, because there have been a few changes. So let's get straight into it. Arsenal beat Manchester City 3-0, and there's one conclusion I came away with from this game more than anything else. We need an Arsenal defender. We've spent weeks debating exactly which Arsenal defender we want, but after watching this, I'm increasingly convinced that I simply want access to this defence. And two players we've spoken about extensively on FPL Heritage both started, Calafiori and Ben White. They lined up at fullback, and both gave us something very interesting from an FPL perspective. Let's start with Calafiori, because we didn't exactly have to wait very long to see his attacking potential. He scored inside the first minute. Now, obviously, I'm not expecting Calafiori to score every 60 seconds once the Premier League starts, but forget the goal for a moment. What interested me was where he was playing. He was incredibly aggressive, he was getting forward, he was arriving in dangerous positions, and that's exactly why I've been so interested in him from the very start. Because if we're getting access to one of the best defences in the league and genuine attacking potential from our defender, that had an extremely attractive FPL combination. And then on the opposite side, we had Ben White. White didn't get the goal, but he demonstrated another potential route to points, DEFCON. He hit the defensive contribution threshold, including an absolute brilliant block from a Doku effort. And that's where Arsenal defenders become particularly interesting this season. We're no longer simply asking, will Arsenal keep a clean sheet? Majority of the time we know they will. We're potentially getting clean sheets, attacking returns, bonus, and now DEFCONs as well. That's a lot of different routes to an FPL return. Havertz and Odegaard also got themselves on the score sheet, but there was another Arsenal attacker who really caught my attention, Zalise. I thought he looked excellent from the left, direct, aggressive, constantly looking to make something happen, and he finished with 2 assists. Now, am I telling you that Zalise suddenly needs to be in every Game Week 1 draft? No. But if we get confirmation that he's likely to start, could he be a cheeky Game Week 1 punt? I think he could. He's certainly gone onto my watch list. Now let's talk about City. City were poor, but this is exactly where our preseason rule becomes important. Don't chase the result, follow the clues. Haaland, O'Reilly, Doku were all making their first appearances of preseason, and honestly, you could tell. They looked rusty, City didn't have the same sharpness Arsenal did. So I'm certainly not ripping up my FPL team because City lost 3-0. But there are two things I think we need to focus on, and the first is the rather large Norwegian elephant in the room. Haaland played 53 minutes, and strangely enough, I think that's actually the most encouraging part of his performance, because 53 minutes here makes me increasingly confident that Haaland starts Game Week 1. Was he at his best? No. He looked slightly off the pace, he wasn't particularly threatening, and you could tell he was getting his first proper minutes into his legs. But there's something else we need to remember. He's not going to play Arsenal every week. I'm certainly not taking Haaland out of my draft because he struggled against one of the strongest defences in the league. However, there is one thing this performance has changed slightly for me. The Game Week 1 captaincy. Before this game, Haaland might have felt like the obvious choice. Now, I'm not quite as convinced. He's absolutely still in the conversation, but considering his limited preseason minutes and what we saw today, I think the captaincy is now genuinely up for debate. And there was another City observation that I think is potentially very important for FPL. The wingers were extremely wide in Maresca's system. At times they were almost glued to the touchline, and we've seen this before from Enzo Maresca. It's very similar to what he implemented at Chelsea. From a football perspective, you can understand it. Stretch the opposition, create space centrally, give the team width. But from an FPL perspective, I'm immediately asking, what does that mean for Semenyo? Because I want Semenyo getting into the box. I want him occupying goal-scoring positions. I don't particularly want one of my FPL midfielders receiving the box from the chalk of his boot 40 yards from goal. Now, it's one game. We're not overreacting, but it's something I'm watching very carefully. And right now, I think it makes me slightly less enthusiastic about starting the season with Semenyo. But if you ask me for one thing I've learned from this game, it's Arsenal. We've spent so much time worrying about who starts in defence that I think we're in danger of missing the bigger picture. It's still Arsenal. Calafiori started and scored, White started and hit DEFCON, City didn't score. So despite the uncertainty surrounding exactly how that back four lines up, I want an Arsenal defender in my Game Week 1 team, maybe even two. The question is simply, which ones do you get? And we'll answer that when we get to my final draft. But first, the Community Shield wasn't the only game that gave us some interesting clues, because across the rest of preseason, we've had missed penalties, potential 4.5 million defensive bargains, players forcing their way into our thinking, and even an FPL defender scoring a bicycle kick. So let's get into it. Let's start with United, and probably the biggest surprise before the game was seeing Mbeumo left out of the starting 11. Personally, I wouldn't read too much into that just yet. Cunha needed minutes, and this is still pre-season, so there are always going to be fitness considerations involved. But I do think it gives us something to think about. We've been discussing Mbeumo now for the last couple of weeks, almost as if he's going to be a guaranteed 90-minute player every week. Maybe he isn't. That doesn't suddenly make him a bad FPL option. Far from it. But when we're spending that much of our budget, minutes matter. It's worth noting United still have the best opening two fixtures to start the season, and that's something clearly I'll be keeping an eye on going into Game Week 1. The other interesting development was Harry Maguire. Once again, United were clearly looking for him from set pieces, and this time it paid off. Fernandes delivered the corner, Maguire scored, and now with Casemiro gone, I do wonder whether we're going to see even more of that this season. Maguire has always carried an aerial threat, but if United are deliberately designing set pieces around finding him, suddenly that FPL appeal becomes considerably more interesting. Then we have Luke Shaw. It wasn't his best performance. He was taken on a few times defensively and didn't look quite as secure as we've seen him previously. From an FPL perspective, there's another statistic that perhaps is much more important. Shaw has started 4 of United's last 5 preseason games. At this point, he looks very likely to start at left back. At £0.5 million cheaper than Harry Maguire, when you're looking for United defensive coverage, both are giving us increasingly strong indication of minutes. And finally, Bruno Fernandes missed another penalty. That's now 2 penalty misses in consecutive games. Let's just hope he's getting them all out of his system before Game Week 1. I'm certainly not removing Bruno because of 2 preseason penalties. We know the quality he possesses, we know how important he is to United, and we know how attractive those opening fixtures are. United ultimately lost the game 4-2 to Milan, which obviously isn't ideal from a defensive perspective. But the players on our FPL radar remain very interesting. Shaw, 4 starts in the last 5. Maguire, 4 starts in the last 5 with genuine set-piece threat. Mbeumo, 3 goals and 1 assist across pre-season, despite not starting the final game. And Bruno, still at the heart of everything almost United do. Next up, let's talk about Liverpool. They finished their pre-season preparations with a 2-0 win over Como at Anfield, and I actually think there were quite few useful clues in this one. Let's start with Cody Gakpo. Cody Gakpo has been heavily linked to Spurs over this summer, with an £80 million move on the cards. If he does potentially get this move to Tottenham, he'll be a massive FPL asset, as he would probably be playing in the number 9 position. This was a really encouraging performance from him, got himself on the score sheet, and was heavily involved throughout Liverpool's attacking play. And that's exactly what we want to see from him going into Game Week 1. Looking sharper, getting into dangerous areas, and producing. And now we know there's going to be competition in Liverpool for this attack, so I'm not necessarily saying Gakpo suddenly becomes an automatic pick. However, there will be some FPL upside there if he does have his move to Spurs. Jeremy Yacket at £5 million. Now we've got one of the more interesting defensive options in the game. And what a way to introduce yourself at Anfield. He started alongside Van Dijk, scored Liverpool's second goal, and received a brilliant reception from the crowd. Reports from the game were extremely positive about his performance generally as well, not just the goal. And that's where it becomes really interesting for us, because £5 million for a potentially starting Liverpool centre-back immediately gets our attention. If he's going to carry some set-piece threat as well, even better. The obvious question is he nailed? Because that's what we need to establish before Game Week 1. Iraola has options at centre-back, and Yacket was replaced at half-time by Roland Arayo here, so I wouldn't automatically assume 90 minutes every week from what we've seen today. But at £5 million, he's absolutely someone we need to monitor. And then we get to somebody we've talked repeatedly about on this channel, Dominic Szoboszlai. I thought he looked class again. There's an energy to him that I think suits Iraola's football extremely well. He's aggressive, he's technically excellent, he's capable of carrying the ball forward. And importantly, he's got the physical capacity to cope with a system that asks its players to work incredibly hard. And that's something I'm increasingly thinking about when assessing this Liverpool midfield. Because it's not simply who's the most talented player, it's who's best suited to what Iraola's asking them to do. And Szoboszlai looks like a very natural fit. He's also coming off a season in which he was one of the Liverpool's stronger individual performers. So this isn't purely a pre-season reaction. He's firmly in my thinking. And that brings us on to Florian Wirtz, because this is probably the most interesting FPL discussion from the Liverpool game. Wirtz started in the number 10 position and lasted until the 73rd minute. And I want to be very careful here. I'm not questioning Wirtz's ability. We know how talented he is. And Iraola using him in that number 10 position is theoretically very attractive for FPL. Recent reporting also suggests that that's the role Liverpool envisioned for him. And that's what I talked about in episode 2 of FPL Heritage. But I'm beginning to question whether I want to start the season with him. Because Iraola's football is demanding. The press is aggressive, the intensity is high, and the transitions are very quick. And we've already seen Iraola himself talking about Liverpool's difficulty sustaining their intensity across games during this pre-season. And that's where I have concern with Wirtz. Can he give Iraola exactly what he wants for 90 minutes? Maybe not right now, but maybe eventually. But I'm not convinced we're there yet. And from an FPL perspective, that matters enormously. Because I'm spending significant money on an attacking midfielder, I don't really want to be looking at the clock every week, wondering whether he's coming off after 65 or 70 minutes. Those final 20 minutes are often when games become stretched. They're often when tired defenders make mistakes. And they're often when our premium attacking players can pick up another goal or an assist. So right now, I think Wirtz may be one to watch rather than owning. Next up, Brighton. And I think this is one of the more interesting teams from an FPL perspective because there are several budget options we're currently considering. Let's start with Pascal Gross. We've spoken about him throughout pre-season, set pieces, penalties, a potentially excellent budget enabler. And again, there were encouraging signs here. He looked positive, continued taking set pieces, and as I've already seen during pre-season, he's capable of scoring from the penalty spot as well. However, there is one major caveat that I don't think we should ignore. Brighton have European fixtures against Tromsø before Game Week 1 and again before Game Week 2. That introduces something we really didn't want when we're building an early FPL squad, rotation risk. Particularly if we're thinking about a bench boost. The player can be brilliant value, but brilliant value doesn't help us very much if he's sitting on the bench when we need him. So Gross remains firmly on my radar, but Europe definitely makes the situation much more complicated. Then we have Vuskovic. I said this in episode 1, and I'm going to say it again. This guy's an absolute baller. At £5 million, I think there's a genuine possibility that he ends up making a mockery of that price tag. He started the latest preseason game and hit the DEFCON threshold during his start. He's also a genuine threat during set pieces, so now we've potentially got 3 different routes to points. Clean sheets, DEFCON, and attacking returns from dead ball situations. That's exactly the sort of profile we're looking for. And then there's Gomez. He's attracted attention from the FPL community because of his price tag and the possibility that he starts. But he appeared to limp off, so that's firmly in the do not make a decision yet category. If he's fit and starting, the price makes him interesting. If there's any injury concern whatsoever, there's absolutely no reason to gamble before Game Week 1. That's one to monitor, guys. Now let's talk about Leeds, because Leeds look like they're going to be a lot of fun this season. And we have to start with Mihajlovic. If you haven't seen the bicycle kick yet, go and find it on social media. An FPL defender scoring a bicycle kick in pre-season is exactly the sort of ridiculous thing we need before the season has even started. But underneath a spectacular goal, there's actually something much more useful for FPL. It's becoming increasingly apparent that Mihajlovic and Joe Rodon are major targets from Ampadu's long throws, and that's something that could be repeatable. Daniel Farker even joked about the positions Rodon was taking up on the right, comparing him to Salah, and calling him Joe Salah. But now I'm not quite ready to captain Joe Rodon in Game Week 1. But at 4.5 million, there's definitely something here. And honestly, I don't think you can go particularly wrong between Rodon and Mihajlovic at the moment. Both offer minutes, both offer aerial threat, both can benefit from those long throws, and both are sitting at a very attractive FPL price. Then there's Dominic Calvert-Lewin. He's template for the reason. He's the main man for Leeds. He was heavily involved again and picked up an assist, taking his pre-season tally to 2 goals and 1 assist. Nothing I've seen here has made me want to move away from him. If anything, pre-season has strengthened this argument. Chelsea are fascinating because it looks like we're beginning to see their identity under Alonso. There's a possibility of a back 3, which obviously brings us back to the memories of the system Alonso used so successfully at Leverkusen. And one player who immediately catches the eye in that structure is Palestra. Honestly, he looks like a Marcos Alonso regen. He's consistently arriving in the box and taking up incredibly advanced positions. From an FPL perspective, that's exactly what we want to see. The problem, we haven't really seen the attacking returns just yet. No goals, no assists, and the XG just aren't there. So while the positioning is incredibly encouraging, I think Game Week 1 might be slightly too early for me. He's absolutely on the watch list though. And then we have João Pedro, and there isn't much debate here. He's absolutely flying. Another 2 goals yesterday takes him to a total of 7 goals across pre-season. 7! At some point we have to stop calling it a good pre-season and simply acknowledge that he's in ridiculous form. He's going to be extremely difficult to leave out. Then there was Rodgers, who made his unofficial debut and didn't take long to announce himself. He scored early and, important for FPL, appears to be operating just behind the striker. That's a position I'm very interested in. I'm not necessarily starting the season with him, but he's gone straight onto the watch list. Then there's Cole Palmer. Everyone's watching him. The quality obviously isn't in question. What I'm watching is his positioning. There have been moments where he's drifting slightly wider than I'd ideally want from an FPL perspective. That doesn't mean Palmer suddenly becomes a bad pick. But at his price, I want him as close to goal as possible. So I think we need the first few game weeks to tell us exactly how Alonso tends to utilise him. Now let's move on to my team Spurs. And I had the advantage of actually being at this game, so I got a really good look at some of these players. With Udogie carrying a slight injury, Robertson started, and I thought he looked excellent. Really solid performance, and importantly from an FPL perspective, he picked up an assist for Richarlison. Definitely one to keep an eye on depending on what happens with Udogie's fitness. But my standout player was Van Hecke. I thought he was absolutely superb. For me, man of the match. He picked up DEFCONs during his start, and from what I'm seeing, he looks like he's going to be a major part of De Zerbi's side. That's exactly the sort of defender I want to identify early. Someone who isn't completely dependent on a clean sheet to produce points. Tonali was another interesting one. He was getting into promising positions and took some set pieces. However, we have to put an asterisk next to that because Pedro Porro wasn't playing, and we know how much Porro normally dominates those situations. So Tonali is interesting, but I wouldn't assume those set pieces belong to him permanently just yet. And then we get to the Spurs forwards, and honestly, I'm staying away for now. Solanke is injured, De Zerbi continues to be linked with players like Gakpo, Savinho, and another central number 9. There's too much uncertainty. We need to solve every FPL position before game week 1. Sometimes the best decision is simply just to wait. And finally, let's quickly go around some of the other games because there are a few very interesting FPL developments. Sunderland beat Rennes 2-1 with Brobbey and Hume getting the goals. And that's now 2 goals in consecutive games for Hume. Remember, FPL lists this guy as a defender. If this was old school FPL, before DEFCONs changed how we evaluate defenders, I'm convinced Hume would be sitting at about 70% ownership by now. He's getting forward, he's scoring, and he's potentially giving us attacking returns from a defensive slot. Very interesting. Lefebvre, who I was quite hot on at the start of the preseason, didn't show us much in attacking areas. He's still interesting because of his potential role on penalties and set pieces, but this particular performance didn't move the needle for me. Everton drew 1-1 to Lille, and Ndiaye scored from the penalty spot again. I think we can feel confident in saying that he's Everton's number 1 penalty taker. More importantly, he was heavily involved in their attacking play generally. Ipswich won 4-2, and one of our favourite cheap defenders actually got himself on the score sheet, O'Shea. Captain, £4 million, goal, lovely, job done. But there's an important tactical detail. He played right back. That's something we need to monitor because his route to DEFCONs is potentially much stronger at centre-back than at full-back. Meanwhile, popular pick Diop occupied the central role. So the goal is encouraging, the position perhaps is slightly less so. And finally, Brentford. What a result. And more importantly, Zingari scored. Those of you who followed FPL Heritage from the beginning already know how much I like this guy. I've been talking about him as a potential DEFCON machine since before his move, and now he's casually decided to score from about 20 yards as well. Maybe the secret's out now, but Sangari wasn't the only one. Sade finished with 2 goals and 2 assists. We know what he's like in FPL. When he's hot, he's hot. And he's always been a streaky player, so when he starts producing like this, I pay attention. Do you remember that 17-point haul he got last season? Definitely one to monitor. Dango scored, Thiago scored twice. Both deserve consideration. And there's one final player I want to mention, Aya. At 4.5 million, he started with what I look like to be the first team squad. If he's going to begin the season as the starting centre-back at that price, suddenly we potentially got another very useful budget defensive option. So, what has all of that actually changed? Because that's ultimately what preseason analysis is for. We're not collecting goals and assists just because they're interesting. We're trying to work out who's starting, who's getting into dangerous positions, who's taking set pieces, who can generate DEFCON. And crucially, which of these players actually deserves a place in our Game Week 1 squad? Because after everything we've seen over the last few weeks, my thinking has changed in a few positions. Some players have strengthened their case, some have moved down the list, and a couple have forced their way into serious consideration. So now it's time. Let's take everything we've learned from preseason and build the FPL Heritage Game Week 1 draft. Right then. We've gone through the Community Shield, we've gone through preseason, we've looked at minutes, positions, penalties, set pieces, DEFCONs, and some of the players who have really forced themselves into the conversation. So now comes the important bit. What has this actually done to my team? And this is where I'm currently at. Now remember, we're going to Game Week 1 with bench boost still active. And I'm also building this team with a relatively short-term mindset. I'm not necessarily asking, is this the perfect team for the next 10 game weeks? I'm asking, is this the perfect team that gives me the best opportunity to attack the opening 3? And I think that distinction is really important because there are a couple of selections here that might look aggressive, but they're aggressive for a reason. Goalkeepers, Kinski, 4.5 million, nothing's changed. We've spoken about him plenty on the channel already, so I don't think we need to spend too much time here. At 4.5 million, I'm happy with him. He's in. Le Mans, again, £5 million, doubling up on United's defence. Let's see how it goes attacking those 2 opening fixtures. Let's move on. And this is probably the most interesting part of the draft, because I've decided to put more money into defence. O'Shea and Rodon both keep their places, and if you watch the rest of this video, you'll understand why. We've discussed potential routes to points, we've discussed defcons, we've discussed attacking threat. And at their prices, I still think both give us exactly what we need from a bench boost squad. Mr. Joe Salah here. But there has been one change. Luke Shaw's out, Harry Maguire's in. And I actually feel a lot more comfortable with it. We saw again during pre-season that United are targeting Maguire from set pieces. He scored from a Bruno Fernandes corner, and when you combine that aerial threat with his potential for defensive contributions, I think he's got multiple routes to points. That's what I'm looking at from defenders this season. I don't want somebody just to give me a clean sheet. Can you get me defcons? Can you threaten from corners? Can you nick me a goal? Can you get bonus when the clean sheet does arrive? With Maguire, I think there's enough there to justify the upgrade from Shaw. So he's made the team. And then we get to the decision that today's Community Shield has probably cemented for me. White, Calafiori, both in. Now I know what people will immediately say. This is so knee-jerk. Do you really need 2 Arsenal defenders? For an entire season, maybe not. But that's not what I'm doing. This is a 3 game week plan because I intend to wildcard either game week 4 or at game week 6. And after everything we've seen, I think there's a very strong argument for attacking Arsenal defensively. Calafiori scored after just 23 seconds in the Community Shield, while Arsenal kept Manchester City out completely in a 3-0 win. And it's not simply the clean sheet potential. We've got Calafiori getting forward. We've got White going forward, showing DEFCON potential. We've got attacking routes. We've got one of the strongest defences in the league. So for this opening period, I'm prepared to double up. It might be aggressive, but it might also pay off. Of course, you can't spend the money everywhere. And while getting White and Calafiori into this squad has meant making a sacrifice further forward. And Mbeumo is out. And that's probably one of the biggest calls I've made, because I like Mbeumo. We've seen that attacking potential throughout pre-season, but I've just got one concern, the minutes. And it has nothing to do with the last pre-season game. I'm just not completely convinced he's going to be a 90-minute player consistently. And when I'm paying that much for a midfielder, I want those additional minutes. So I've decided to redistribute the money. And the player coming in is someone that we've just talked about. Iliman Ndiaye. And I really like this one. We've seen him involvement throughout Everton's pre-season. He's getting into dangerous positions. He's heavily involved in their attacks. And crucially, his move to Saudi has been called off. He's taking penalties, and whilst he also scored another spot kit in Everton's final friendly, at 6 million, that interests me enormously. Is Ndiaye going to match Mbeumo point for point? Maybe not. But that's not the comparison I'm making. It's Ndiaye plus what the extra money allows me to do elsewhere versus Mbeumo in a weaker squad. And for a bench boost in particular, I prefer the balance this gives me. The midfield core remains. The other 3 midfielders stay. Bruno Fernandes, Dominic Szoboszlai, and Pascal Gross. Bruno stays because I still think he's one of the strongest FPL assets available to us. I'm not going to let a couple of pre-season penalty misses suddenly make me forget the underlying appeal. The current set-piece projections still have Fernandes at the front of United's dead ball responsibilities. Szoboszlai stays because honestly, I just like what I'm seeing. He looks suited to Iraola, he's got the engine for the system, he's got set-piece involvement, and I think he's looked class throughout pre-season. Gross stays as well. So that gives us another midfielder that I'm pretty comfortable with. And then we've got this fun one. Zelis. Yes, I've done it. Christos Zelis is in the FPL Heritage Draft. And I can already hear some of you, you're chasing the Community Shield. This is so knee-jerk. Maybe this is a little bit knee-jerky. I'll admit that, I'll accept that. But I just don't think this is just a Community Shield reaction. Zelis has been producing throughout the whole of pre-season. The Premier League own pre-season review had him on 1 goal and 4 assists, predominantly from the left, before he even went then and produced another 2 assists against Man City. That's a sustained evidence, and most importantly, he looks likely that he's going to start at left wing. For a long-term FPL pick, perhaps we need more information, but remember the strategy. 3 weeks. I'm looking for upside. I'm chasing that differential. I'm looking for somebody who can potentially explode before everyone moves on to him. And if Zelis is starting on the left for this Arsenal attack, I'm willing to take the gamble. It could absolutely backfire. But this is the type of FPL pun I like. Not a random differential for the sake of being different, a player where we actually have evidence pointing towards an opportunity. And finally, my front three haven't changed. João Pedro, Dominic Calvert-Lewin, and Erling Haaland. João Pedro's preseason form has been too good for me to move away from. Calvert-Lewin remains the focal point of that Leeds attack and gives me exactly what I'm looking for at his price. And Haaland, even though his Community Shield wasn't inspiring, it's still Erling Haaland. I'm not going to suddenly remove Erling Haaland because he struggled against Arsenal. He's not going to play them every week, so Haaland stays. The much bigger question for me now isn't, do I own Haaland? It's, do I captain him? And that's something I'm going to be thinking about right up until the deadline. I actually really like this draft, but importantly, I know it's not perfect, and I don't want to pretend it is. There are risks. Double Arsenal defence could punish me if they concede. Zelis could be a classic preseason bait. Ndai might not even give us that explosive ceiling Mbeumo does. Maguire relies on United actually being defensively competent. And now that I'm doubling on Lamens, that's going to make it even more trickier. And we're putting a lot of faith in players that we've identified throughout preseason. But that's FPL. At some point, you have to make a decision. And there's a clear strategy behind every decision here. We're not just selecting 15 individual good players. We're building specifically for the opening 3 game weeks. And most importantly, we're bench boosting in game week 1. So I want 15 players who can contribute. I want multiple routes to points. I want defcons. I want set pieces. I want penalties. I want attacking defenders. And I want a couple of calculated upside picks. That's what this squad gives me. And with that, preseason is done. We spent the last few weeks analysing fixtures, looking through the data, comparing players, watching preseason, tracking starting lineups, looking at new managers, new systems, penalties, defcons, and probably changing our drafts far more times than any sensible human being should. But now, it's almost time. Game week 1 is here, and this is where all the preparation finally matters. Now I want to hear from you. What do you think of the FPL Heritage Draft? Would you double up on Arsenal defence? Would you take the Zelis gamble? Would you keep Mbeumo instead of Ndai? And most importantly, who are you captaining in Game Week 1? Let me know your team down below and your biggest final decisions in the comments. I generally want to see what everyone has landed on. And if you enjoyed the preseason series and you found any of these videos useful, please consider subscribing to FPL Heritage, because this is where the channel really begins. Once the season starts, we'll be here every week looking at what actually happened, what the underlying numbers tell us, which players we should be targeting, and how we can stay ahead of the game. No chasing last week's points, no knee-jerking after one bad game week. We follow the evidence, we follow the clues, and we play the long game. But for all that, there's just one thing left to do. Lock in Game Week 1. Good luck with your final drafts, good luck with your bench boost if you're joining me, and I'll see you after the deadline for Game Week 1. This is FPL Heritage. Let's have a season.